Hello, thank you all for coming to our first annual Economic Ideas Forum. I'm Lynn Kiesling, I'm faculty member in the economics department. I'm the associate director of the John H. Schnatter Center for Economic Research at Purdue. The center was founded 3 years ago as the Purdue University Research Center in Economics, and its mission is increasing understanding about how economic markets work, how wealth is created, and the impact of government regulation. The vision of the center is to become a leading producer of policy research that examines the marketplace and increases knowledge regarding government regulation and its impact on the economy, prosperity, and innovative endeavors. Our focus is on regulatory and policy-relevant economic analysis. This Economic Ideas Forum is a result of generous support from the Hugh and Judy Pence family, and they're here with us today, so I'm thrilled that we can thank them in person for their generous support of our work. So, thank you. Thank you. I also want to thank Professor John Umbeck for his leadership in starting this research center and setting it up for success. And a final round of thank yous before I introduce our participants in our fireside chat today. I'd like to thank Krannert's external relations team, in particular Lou Underwood, who's done a great job with logistics, and the folks who have done the communications and logistics have been great, including Tim Newton, Chris Knotts, and Marion Canova as well. So thank you very much. We're really honored to have James Heckman as our guest for the first Economic Ideas Forum. Professor Heckman is the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor in Economics and the College at the University of Chicago. There, he also serves as the director of the Center for the Economics of Human Development and director of the Center for Social Program Evaluation. In 2000, he was awarded the Bank of Sweden Memorial Prize in honor of Alfred Nobel. I think that's the way it goes now, for his work in microeconometrics. Among his other accomplishments, he's a member of the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Econometric Society, and the National Academy of Sciences. At Chicago, he also has appointments in the law school and the Harris School of Public Policy. This afternoon, we're featuring Professor Heckman in conversation with David Hummels, Dean of the Krannert School of Management. Dean Hummels is a faculty member in the economics department, as well as a leading scholar in international trade on questions involving offshoring, product differentiation, barriers to trade, and the broader impacts of aviation, infrastructure, and trade facilitation on trade and economic development. So please join me in welcoming them.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. Our plan for this afternoon is for us to have a back and forth for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes of Q&A from the audience. So as we go along, be thinking about some questions that you can pose to Professor Heckman. So I want to jump right in with a couple of questions. Actually, we were sort of sharing some notes on the way over. He grew up in Colorado, I grew up in Colorado. He was a Boettcher scholar, I was a Boettcher scholar. We were both on faculty at Chicago for a while. He has a Nobel, I don't. But nevertheless.
Yet,
yes. I like that optimism. So let's start. So your undergraduate degree was from Colorado College in mathematics. How did you become interested in pursuing economics?
well, I went to a liberal arts college, which may not be a welcome thing to say here at Purdue. But I went, and one of the benefits of that college at that time in particular was the students could take a lot of independent readings courses and venture out. So, you know, as I was interested in mathematics from the beginning, I found it interesting. I enjoyed it. It was, and physics too, took a lot of physics. But I also was interested in social science, such as I understood it at the time. And so I shopped around. So by shopping around, I mean I took a short, small, two-credit course in anthropology, courses in other fields, actually, in social science. And then by accident, more or less, I took a class in my junior year on what would you think now is the history of economic thought, but it was really a class about development. So starting with Adam Smith, you know, looking at Ricardo, going through the classics, and at that time going through this work by Arthur Lewis, actually, Theory of Economic Development. And so it was to me, it was an extremely interesting class. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't just a single tutorial, it was a group of us together. And I found it to be very, very stimulating, and more than stimulating, I just thought, this is an interesting field. And some of the economists then said, look, you know mathematics. Mathematics is highly valued in economics. Think about becoming an economist. So I took more courses in economics, and I liked them. And it was a field that I thought was extremely good. In fact, one of my teachers there at Colorado College gave me his copy of Samuelson's Foundations of Economic Analysis. And I looked at the book, I read it, it was fascinating to me. I mean, I had physics. It was basically, 19th, early 20th century physics applied to economics. But to me, it was interesting, very interesting. So I thought, well, this is a pretty good field. So I ended up going to graduate school in economics. That's how it just, by accident. Everything happens by accident. I went to Colorado College in the first place. So there's a series of accidents. But I think that was, to me, it was very interesting. And it did allow me to, because all my life as an undergraduate, I actually was interested in social questions. But I didn't really have much of a framework to analyze these social questions. Civil rights was a big issue at that time. Still is now, I guess, but in a different form. And, questions about trade and inflation, these are all good questions. And I thought I could really learn something about it.
So speaking of your time at Princeton, there had been a growth in the use of highly aggregated macro data up into the time you were there. But what really spurred the growth and sort of the applications in the area of disaggregated microeconomic data sets?
Well, it's interesting. One of my first fields at Princeton actually was in something would be called macro time series analysis. So I did a lot of work on spectral density estimation. Princeton was very strong at the time. John Tukey was alive and well, and there were people like Granger and Hatanaka who had just left when I arrived, and their legacy was there. The book is still sometimes used for aggregate time series. So I did a lot of time. There was an economist there named Phil Howry who was probably not so well known, but he was the undergraduate thesis advisor of John Taylor. Okay. And Taylor just posted his undergraduate thesis at his website. He sent me the link recently. And it's interesting because it was feedback control applied to the economy. These questions fascinated me. I thought this is really great. And Howry. But then I started doing the spectral density estimation on the then fairly short macro time series. And I had like 25 observations. And even though it's a simple form of non-parametric estimation, it was pretty unstable, the numbers. I came a little disillusioned with that. So I kind of moved away thinking maybe there wasn't so much data there. And I was empirically oriented. I was doing a lot of, I thought data were interesting. I did a lot of demography, actually, at the same time. But what happened to me, and I think it happened to a lot of people at that time, was that certain kinds of data became available. So literally at that time, Lyndon Johnson had this war on poverty that actually created a lot of programs in the United States. But one of the legacies, which I don't think is sufficiently appreciated, is that part of the war on poverty, somebody, I don't know who it was, insisted that the programs that were put in place be evaluated. Okay. So there was an evaluation mentality, and with it, the collection of data. And it was microeconomic data. So one of the data sets collected was a survey, so-called Survey of Economic Opportunity, and that was more or less the first wave, the first survey of what we think of as the PSID now, which has been going for close to 50 years. And
that's the panel study on income dynamics.
Yeah, panel study. It's very widely used for studying income dynamics, even to this day. So, and then I got interested in that. They were large data sets, but Princeton had good computer power. At least I thought it. Relative technology. I mean, the handheld technologies would dominate. But Princeton was really doing a lot of applied science, in particular weather forecasting. It was a legacy of John von Neumann, actually, that they had this system of differential equations they would solve each night on what was then a high-end technology called IBM 36091. Probably you didn't know it. But, you'd feed cards into a card reader and so forth. But it gave a relative sense of power. And I mean, I could really do things. And so I got these data. And then there's some other data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Women. And I just got very interested in this whole question of female labor supply. And then by chance, a very famous economist from Columbia came down, gave a lecture at Princeton. His name was Jacob Minzer. He became my colleague later. And I found his work extremely interesting. He worked on the labor supply of women. So these things kind of went together. And I said, there's a huge amount of opportunity. I remember thinking, look, these guys who are looking at labor supply don't really understand the theory of consumer demand. That was Samuelson circa the foundation, the foundations of economic analysis. And so I thought, there's some not only arbitrage opportunity, but really interesting to look at, the household as a utility maximizing model and to use modern consumer theory. So there really was a sense that the labor economists of the day didn't know what an income effect was, didn't really know what a compensated effect was, and things that we now think are completely standard. It just was, there was a little bit of a cultural lag. And at Princeton in particular, a lot of the labor economists were basically institutionalists. There was a young guy with whom I wrote quite a few papers, Orley Ashenfelter, who was a senior graduate student, but we interacted a lot and wrote papers. So what happened is the data were available, and these techniques were fascinating. There were a whole set of questions. I really didn't know how to analyze binary data. I mean, you could do it by regression, but I thought, there are some problems. And at the time, there was a book out by Arthur Goldberger, An Econometric Theory. And if you read the book, still, I don't know if it's in print, but he does have like 2 or 3 pages on binary data. It's not, but he created some interesting ideas. Just to me, it was interesting. And I really thought it would be very, very useful to kind of look at this. So I went between statistics and economics. I took a lot of statistics courses, worked with Tukey. Worked with him. I talked to him. He was a very open guy in many ways. But I wasn't satisfied. I thought, the idea was to try to understand the mechanisms of labor supply. And so very obvious questions were things like, look, you have a lot of data missing on wages for women who aren't working. How am I going to determine the labor supply? So very simple model, but at the time people weren't really estimating things like reservation wage. And so I could see, I can derive the reservation wage. So I have an early paper in Econometrica doing exactly that and using then the participation decision to work or not, I should say, as a source of information on preferences. And so that was actually, as Minzer put it, turning a problem into a source of new ideas. So I just got fascinated, and one thing led to another. And I got interested in life cycle labor supply, but the data were there. But in truth, most of what I wrote for my thesis was I never published. I mean, I went on and got into more interesting things because I moved on to Columbia and found some very interesting colleagues.
So this pattern of newly available data reshaping fields and rethinking, causing us to rethink ways to approach problems, seems to repeat itself at various points in time. I mean, we're certainly in the middle of one of these eras right now where everything under the sun is measured. I think anybody out there with a smartphone active right now, we're tracking your location to see where you're at, and a whole host of other things. Digital ag on this campus, we're sort of measuring moisture in the soil at 1 centimeter grids.
Right.
And so, I think as you sort of think about how that kind of availability of data reshaped your work, any thoughts on what this sort of new wave of ubiquitous data is going to do to how we approach these fields?
Oh, I think, for example, that the use now of administrative records. You were talking about the Danish data. I'm actually using that as well.
We should write together.
Oh, that's fine. No, but actually I am. I'm actually giving a paper in Denmark in a few weeks looking at inequality in Denmark, which is actually more than most people want to acknowledge and most Danes want to acknowledge. That's another whole subject. But the fact that you can put together lifetime records, you mentioned health data, but you can also get data on crime, education, early health, like scores in school, health register data. and you can follow these people over their life cycles. So I think that kind of administrative data, and then the matched worker firm data, is changing what we think can be done. I mean, you know, recently in the US, we've had some attempts to integrate administrative data. We've been slower, much slower. But recently, the IRS data is being merged slowly. It's not a very good process yet, but slowly being merged to Census and American Community Survey data. And you're basically going to get now, I think, much richer histories about labor force and, you know, social dynamics and income mobility. So I think, you know, once the data are available, I think economists exploit these opportunities. And I think now economists have become very, very sophisticated in not only analyzing the data, but suggesting how to create data.
Do you think it should change the way we train students at the PhD level or even as undergraduates?
Well, I think the idea of economics as an empirical field has become more feasible, if you want to say, precisely because of computing power, but also because of all these data sources you just mentioned. So, you know, for example, going back to the Danish data, I remember I was talking about social mobility in the US. I had a postdoc from Denmark. And in the course of my lecture, I showed some results from US data. In the course of my lecture, he replicated that analysis on Danish census data, which he had access to. And that created, I mean, first of all, it was an interesting replication. And secondly, it allowed us to imagine what would be useful intercountry studies. So I think, you know, it's just easier to do data. And economists, I think, should be trained, maybe a little more critically, in how to model data analysis. So I think there's been kind of too much enthusiasm for just the purely empirical. And I think asking to step back and interpret the data is still something that needs to be emphasized more. But I do think that particular training is, you know, there's a quote that I frequently use. I hope nobody's heard it before. I mean, it's in the very first issue of Econometrica, the premier journal of, where you just published a paper in economics and statistics and the union of those fields. But this was written in 1933 when the journal was formed. Frisch, very famous economist, Frisch actually was saying that at the beginning is that now data are being collected at a very rapid rate. This is 1933. Kuznets was just starting the national accounts. But what he did say was correct, and even more correct. He says, so there are lots of effects that people are finding, this effect and that. So those were empirical relations. But he said, what's missing is an interpretive framework. And if we're not to be overwhelmed by the data, we really need an interpretive framework. And so in that sense, I think the structure of economic analysis is becoming even more relevant with the abundance of data and so forth. I mean, we don't want to just codify facts. Yeah.
So I was going to say, so you're not a fan of machine learning techniques? Or?
Well, I think machine learning techniques are great. And I think they will develop more in the using prior information in a way they haven't yet. I mean, you could guide a learning algorithm so that it satisfies certain constraints and so forth. It just hasn't been done. And most of the people doing it are not economists. They want to try to do something that's kind of theory-free, and I think that's a mistake for economics. It's great for coming up with good predictors. Wonderful. Very powerful methods. But I think it really is a beginning now, at the beginning. And I think when it starts to really flourish in economics will be when it actually starts being informed by economic theory and informing economic theory. That's the beauty of it. But now we can digest chunks of data that we couldn't do before. And I think we can. The danger is being overrun with these effects that Frisch was talking about in 33. So I gave you 10,000 patterns that came from cross-validated data, and what do I do with it? Mm-hmm. And I think there are some prototypes. I was telling some people earlier today, Justin Tobias in particular, have a student now. He's an assistant professor at Yale these days, but he was using machine learning techniques and some of these big data from Sweden, trying to determine the sources of entrepreneurship, who becomes an entrepreneur or not. So we used machine learning techniques on this Swedish data to get patterns, life cycle patterns, how the earnings dynamics were, who became an entrepreneur, who exited. And the machine learning algorithms, using different parameters for growing the forest and so forth, actually came up with 7 basic patterns. And they were clearly different patterns. They were beautiful patterns. You looked at it, it wasn't like 7,000, it was 7. And then he said, then he could look at those patterns and say, I think I can rationalize that. So he wrote down a very simple economic model to rationalize it. And it did rationalize it to a certain level. But then that simple model didn't capture a lot of other phenomena that many economists want to see. So he built a structural model on top of it. So all 3 parts, that's where machine learning was very creative. But he went beyond just saying, here are the facts, friends. I mean, that's the danger, But the patterns were deeply beautiful. I admired them, I must say. I saw these facts, and they were just amazing what the profiles were. And they really were distinct patterns of entrepreneurial dynamics. So I think I see that as a prototype for what can be done and should be done. I'm sure there are others, but this is the one I know best.
So let me take you back earlier in your career. So you finished at Princeton, and then you joined the faculty at Chicago. So who are you?
Well, Columbia.
Columbia first,
Columbia
right, and then
first.
Chicago. So who are some of your earlier influences in those first positions?
Well, when I was at Columbia, I was a colleague with Jacob Mincer for 3 years. And it turned out that then the National Bureau of Economics Research, which is now headquartered in Cambridge, was in New York. And it was a focal point. So there were people like Finis Welch, who was a leading labor economist. Melvin Reeder was at the graduate school. Bob Willis. A number of people were at the National Bureau. And this Columbia group that I was tossed into and really found very, very stimulating had been developed by Becker and Mincer in previous years. Becker had left. In fact, when I accepted the job at Princeton, at Columbia, Becker had said that he was going back to Columbia. He was visiting Chicago and then changed his mind at the end, but I already signed on. So I wanted to work with Becker and with Mincer because I'd learned a lot about their work in the last years of my life and graduate life at Princeton. But then I found this labor group was very stimulating. They had ideas. They were looking at new data and looking at micro data. And Becker ignited not only that group of senior faculty, but there was a whole host of graduate students who were hanging around. And I actually inherited quite a few of Becker's students. I was on their committees, and it was an education for me. I could read their theses. A lot of them became very distinguished economists in their own right. Somebody like Mark Rosenzweig, who's now at Yale, been at Yale for a while, was an example, but Michael Grossman, there were many, many students. And I found that as an educational experience. Some maybe not as famous. So working on those dissertations and interacting with those people, I found was very stimulating. I just even though I'd read some of the papers, I got immersed in this culture for a while. And people like Welch, there were a lot of good ideas floating around. In that sense, I really enjoyed, I really felt it was stimulating. And people would work night and day. But there were other colleagues as well. So I felt lucky. Columbia was kind of I think in terms of the rankings, Columbia was going down a bit by the time I was there. I don't know what the rank was, but I do remember when it fell off the top 10 list, I was there. And I know Bill Vickery was there, and he was very sad, that the National Research Council had ranked it 11th or something. So the people didn't take themselves as seriously as people would, like at top 1 or 2 places maybe. And so with junior faculty, they were very open. So I got a lot of, go to lunch every day with people like Vickery, Kelvin Lancaster. There were a lot of people like that. And some good junior faculty from whom I learned a tremendous amount. There's a relatively young economist named Raj Chetty, who's making quite a splash. But his father was on the faculty, actually, at Columbia. Okay. And his father was a Bayesian econometrician trained by Arnold Zellner at Wisconsin, who had then come to Columbia. And I learned a tremendous amount of Bayesian econometrics I didn't know from him. I had Zellner's books, and he was also doing optimal control theory. We wrote a bunch of papers, actually. And again, it was flat. I wasn't tenured. He wasn't either, as it turned out. But the point is that I was able to get, so I felt it was a good choice because it wasn't that I wanted to be, but I could learn from these guys and at lunch, and they were open. Then Ned Phelps came a bit later, and so I felt that kind of open exchange was good. And so I really found it stimulating.
So you've spent the large portion of your career at Chicago,
Yes.
and I think there was a time when there was a very well-defined Chicago school of thought.
Correct.
Friedman and Stigler and the rest.
Right.
If you look at the faculties at the places where economists hang around at Chicago now, they seem far more eclectic. So I guess the question is there still a Chicago school, and if so, how would you characterize it?
That's a very good question, and I would say that there are some at Chicago who would say there is no Chicago school, or at least the Chicago school you're referring to is gone. I think there's some truth to that in the following sense, that in the 1960s and 70s, and I think even in the 50s, right, Friedman was championing, a line trying to distinguish, really attacking Keynesian economics, and really the whole idea was applying price theory everywhere. Becker was the supreme example of that and applying it to individual phenomena, fertility, marriage, obviously educational choices and the like. So there was this kind of pioneering zeal but I think there was an atmosphere at that time in a lot of economics departments that incentives really didn't matter. I mean, the Keynesian labor supply model of the time really didn't exist. I mean, really, there was a kind of view, you had these unemployed people hanging around. There wasn't any systematic discussion of choice in the labor market, for example. And in other dimensions, there was a view that, the multiplier worked when, prices were fixed, and, we understood that later. So Chicago was highly distinctive and was running against the notion, which I think was kind of a version of Keynesian economics, and Keynesian economics that was kind of somewhat against the market. The view is the market had failed. Back in the 30s, I think Chicago, even then with people like Knight and Viner, were very actively pushing the view of markets But I would also argue that even in the 30s and 40s, Chicago was somewhat eclectic.
Okay.
See, what people forget was that at the Coles Foundation and in the department, we had Oscar Lange. Oscar Lange wrote the Economic Theory of Socialism while he was at Chicago. We had a lot of people who were very ardent Keynesians, and people like Jacob Marshak and many others, Koopmans. So the fact is these groups were very different. They clashed. I think they clashed too much, and I think that led to the departure of one of the groups. But I think that intellectual tension actually was very fruitful for Chicago at the time. Now you're asking, does the Chicago School exist? There are books written about the Chicago School, even to this day. But they generally stop in the late 70s and early 80s. They kind of peter out, and some of the members of the Chicago School are not at Chicago, who people would be, like McCloskey would be considered still ardent Chicago School, although, he felt rejected by the Chicago School, and he was a he then, so I can properly use that description. But the fact is that I think it has become somewhat less distinctive, and I think as a result, and I think in some sense Chicago was very successful. So by the late 70s, I think many of the Chicago points of view were adopted. I remember as a graduate student, people attacking Becker and considering some kind of fanatic. I mean, who the hell would study fertility and marriage with price theory and these labor supply? Becker was wildly attacked by some demographers because he had babies as consumer durables, and there were things like this. He was making analogies, and he was doing it deliberately provocatively, but he was trying to build incentives in. So he was viewed as a nutcase in the late 60s. But then the work started to become accepted, I think, and it got accepted. And so increasingly, and Friedman left, and Friedman had he was a very smart guy, very open to people. I don't know, you didn't interact with Friedman.
I didn't, no.
He was very open, especially to junior faculty. You could go to dinner with him, you could talk, very fruitful. But he also had a kind of a messianic, he had a mission, and he admits himself that by the late 60s or so, he was more or less out of technical economics. And he was into advocacy for a certain kind of free market approach. But he did bring then attention. He was the Chicago School, and Stigler too. So you had these two articulate people, very, very articulate. And then things got a little more technical with Becker, I guess. And then people like Harry Johnson and Harry Johnson was a dissenter in this whole process. But I think that group still had some tension, and that tension was creative. But I think if you ask kind of the Chicago price theory approach, which is what I would call, what people call the Chicago School, probably has dwindled somewhat in its influence at Chicago. It used to be 3/4 sequence of price theory. Now it's 1/4.
Okay.
And the curriculum is more common. Game theory. Stigler opposed game theory violently, as you know.
Really? Yeah.
Oh yeah. But that was the first round of game theory. This is game theory a la Oscar Morgenstern, 1949, when he was attacking, and monopolistic competition. So there was a sense that Chicago had won because so many people were emulating this, but at the same time there were other developments going on in economics. And I think in some parts of those developments, Chicago was slow, because it was. It's not that it was intolerant. It was slower probably to acknowledge the importance of some of these other mechanisms. We had people like Sandy Grossman, Bengt Holmstrom, but I remember Holmstrom visited and people said, maybe he's not a real economist or something. And some people said that. I always thought he was good. I ended up teaching a class with him at Yale. He's very good. But the point is that I think maybe they slowed down a little bit. And for a while, Chicago became very, very, it kept growing, it quit growing. They had a very fixed aging faculty, and maybe didn't catch up in some sense with some modern developments in economics. But I think that, its lesson is out there. But I think price theory, I think it's unfortunate. I think price theory is very valuable. But I don't know if you teach it here, for example, how much price theory is being taught. But I think it's a very valuable framework for organizing and interpreting data. So anybody, no matter how sophisticated in technically or trying to looking at kind of the basic feel of the data, understanding how prices might work, getting a first cut, I think that's very valuable. And I do think that's starting to diminish. And sadly, I'm afraid that the Chicago School is much less distinctive.
Interesting.
I'll give you an example of how much it's changed. And it's something that some people are deeply offended by, but it's interesting historically. When Stigler came to Chicago, he was given a chair called the Walgreen chair. That's the druggist, the pharmacy chain. It's very rich. He gave a big chair, very well endowed. And that chair he held for, I think, close to 25 years until he died. I think that was basically, he died. Then it was given to Bob Fogel, who was an economic historian. And Fogel was using price theory to explain economic history. Then Fogel died. Well, who got the chair now? Do you know who has the chair?
I don't.
Okay, Richard Thaler. So you went from Stigler to Thaler. And you have to understand that that's quite a change.
That is.
That's quite a change. And in some sense, you can say it's distinctive personality. Certainly is distinctive. But I guess the point is that that the emphasis, think about it for a second. Stigler and Becker were writing, you never want to talk about preferences explaining anything. And you might say that some of the other work, his replacement might be using preferences to explain a lot and maybe everything. So I think there has been that kind of change.
So you mentioned earlier this notion that Friedman sort of shifted his focus into, essentially, he was on a mission.
He was, yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is notable about your career is that recently you have stepped into policy advocacy, especially around early childhood development. At least that's what it looks like from where I sit. Maybe you have a different view of that. And I'm sort of curious about what that progression is like, to go from sort of studying, in a very careful econometric sense, investments in early childhood development, to having a sufficient belief in what you've found to advocate for policy.
Well, this is an area where actually I would honestly defend the statements I make about this question. And when I entered the area, there were some really kind of fuzzy, at least from the point of view of an economist, some fuzzy claims about efficacy, even the notion of what these programs are doing, even the measurement of the skills. So I felt, by looking at primary data sources, original data sources, and then augmenting those data sources, that I really had learned something about the dynamics. People had always talked about the influence of the mother, the family. There was work actually back at Columbia, which is one of those theses. Arlene Leibowitz, who's at UCLA, had done some work on the importance of mother's education on child development. The data were very crude, but it was the kind of in the right spirit of things. But what I found was that, so this was a case where it was accidental. I produced some studies that I think actually showed things like rates of return and showed economic benefits. That got picked up by advocates. So I actually was kind of lifted out of obscurity, at least obscurity in this kind of community. And the work was featured.
Okay.
Because it was viewed as hardcore work. And I think it is. I recently completed a study of looking at rates of return on another program, the ABC Daring program. Very painful work. You're forecasting future earnings. You're accounting for forecast uncertainty. It's tough. And in fact, it's a lot harder than many of these advocates understand. The advocates know the answer, and that bothers me, because I don't know the answer. I have never known the answer in that sense. I still don't know. But I think in this case, I have a pretty good hint that the answer is positive. There's a lot of intuition. So still to this day, it actually is a serious issue in the sense that the advocates, they know the answer. And at some key point, they'll say, well, we know the answer. We don't need any further research. But as we were talking about in an earlier forum today, there's still a lot to be learned about exactly what the mechanisms are, what's an efficient program. And so I find the advocates to be really, I don't enjoy them, to be honest.
Even the people who agree with your work?
Well, just because they agree. I mean, why do they agree? If it's just that they like the conclusion and they reached that before they read my work, it's okay, I guess. I'm happy they use it, but that's not why my work was done in the first place. And as long as they support the work, that's fine. But what happens if you show some negative effects or you challenge some conventional wisdom, and I have in some recent papers and so forth, and they don't like it so much, and they keep their, and I think that's becoming a serious problem for a lot of academic research.
Well, so talk about that a little bit. I think that there's this, this sort of idea about having broader impact and weighing in on policy debates. Do you think that's something academics should stay out of? Should they wade in? What's your view?
Well, I think there's an interesting dynamic that's going on now, and I think it has to do partly with the technology, the social media, but I think increasingly what's happening is that, I think when I was at Chicago early on, I came across some files, and I shouldn't have been reading the files, but they were out in front. They were public, more or less, and they were about how Chicago set up a training program. It turned out in Chile, and you can see the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation. They really wanted economic literacy in South America. They felt Latin America, and the Chileans were willing to host these. So what came out of it was a very long-standing relationship between the University of Chicago and the Catholic University in Chile. But it was a training program. It was a technical training program. People went down, they were teaching labor economics, they were teaching some econometrics, teaching development, public finance, and so forth.
And this is the origin of the Chicago Boys.
Correct. But there was no political motive. But what was interesting, and even earlier, people like, the Ford Foundation wanted to bring Ragnar Frisch to the US because there was a belief, I think at that time, that factually informed policy was the way to do it. I think this was a view that emerged only in the early 20th century. Somebody like Walter Lippmann, in some sense he got arrogant. The idea is that only the expert should be making, you needed experts to make policy. But I think there was a belief that social science could deliver on that. I think nowadays there's less belief. Forget about the presidency. Forget about the president. I think more generally there's a view that's becoming, and I think it's partly the sense that there are a lot of dissenting voices, and there are plenty of willing economists. I don't know if you saw this video that was made about, what was the name of it? it starred some leading economists. It was a video about the financial crisis.
Okay. Oh, The Big Short?
No, even earlier.
I was going to say, because Thaler was in that. He was very entertaining in that.
Yeah, he was entertaining in that, correct. No, but this is earlier than The Big Short.
Okay. All right.
Now, I'm talking about, there was another movie made, and it featured some people who had kind of made consulting reports advising certain liberalization of markets where they collapsed. And so there seemed to be some sense of intellectual corruption going on. Anyway, so I think that some economists, so the view, I think, is that economics is maybe less trusted. And I think there's less demand out there now for for facts. I think it's sad. There's still demand. I think it's very important to put rates of return out there, look at social policy, and make policy on the basis of it. But I'm wondering if that isn't somewhat an antiquated notion in the way public policy is currently made. I know there's some congressmen and senators who do make decisions that way, but I also know there are a lot of people who don't. But I also think there's kind of been an unhealthy relationship between academics and the press. And I think part of it is the decline of government funding, of research. I think there has been. NSF has been cut back. They have some programs. The NIH has been curtailed in some ways. But what's happened to the foundations have come up. Now, most foundations, I don't want to criticize any foundation heads here, but most foundations are headed by people who don't really, they might have certain ideas and certain beliefs, but they may not be all that technically inclined and may be able to evaluate the good from the bad. But many are directly involved in advocacy. They really want conclusions. And so what's the best way to reach a foundation head is to have your work featured in a prominent newspaper or a set of newspapers, to go on media. And so what's happened increasingly is a phenomenon where people say we've gone from public intellectuals to, what is the term that's used as a replacement? But essentially people who are kind of public figures, making broad public statements, sweeping statements, but without a lot of support, but attracting attention.
But don't,
So for example, I would say somebody whom I personally despise is Malcolm Gladwell.
Okay.
Only because he makes so much of this stuff is just nonsense that he makes up. And it's nonsense. It's factual nonsense. And it's harmful nonsense when social policy is made on it. And yet, Barack Obama had Malcolm Gladwell in the White House. And many literate people stop at the level of like the New York Times or some popular journal, Atlantic, or National Review on the other side. So there would be a variety of, so what worries me is that more and more, a lot of the influence of the research is being kind of piped into those figures to make a broad sweeping statement that has a huge impact. Sound bites matter a lot. And as a result, I think the research is being diverted to kind of get your 15 minutes of fame, your headline, and then to tailor your research for that. And I think that is corrupting. I think it is corrupting. But I can understand it's lucrative because, first of all, the foundations and the groups supporting you are getting a lot of visibility in their work. And they're doing it through your research in part, and you're getting a lot of fame and so forth and so on. 15 minutes of fame, though. A lot of these guys come and go and they finally get caught up and people understand what they did. But I think that that is a dynamic that has emerged in the profession.
So what would you urge for a young academic economist whose work may have policy implications? Just urge caution, stay out of it entirely? What do you think?
Well, no, I think our work does have real bearing, on real issues. In the long run, I think it has very great bearing. We know, I still work on some of these questions, early childhood education, job training programs and the like, because I do think down the road, there are informed people who will guide there. So I think we're now kind of in a wave of advocacy and maybe an anti-intellectual wave that's sweeping a lot of policy these days. So I don't know how rational public policy is and how rational. It seems like Congress itself is polarizing and even the discussions are not even, so I don't know, you're an international economist, I can't imagine you're too enthusiastic about the Trump tariffs, for example.
Well, so I think that's, no, I think that's a great example where I think that there's a lot of nonsense out in the public sphere, and that there's a role for people who are trained and informed and who understand the research to be a voice for saying these policies don't make any sense.
Exactly, but I think we should also recognize there are times when there's a heated public feeling one way or the other, where evidence plays a very weak role. But I think one should still aggregate and accumulate that evidence because it does grow. I think in the end, like for example, 60 years ago when people were analyzing education as kind of an investment, you know, the term human capital, some people found offensive. What? Humans as capital? It sounded like slavery or something. It wasn't good. And slaves actually were a form of human capital. But the fact is that, that now everybody accepts it. And people understand it. And they understand that just as a matter of policy, education is good. We look at the rates of return. So I think in the long run, people will think things that hold up and survive the test of time. And there's, you know, economists are good at trying to knock each other off. So as long as they can, you know, survive that process, then I think those things that last will actually be, will have a lasting effect. But it may take a while. So I don't want to stop it, but what I worry about is that a lot of foundations and a lot of groups don't see it that way, and they don't want to support anything but the advocacy group. So somebody willing to make a cheap comment about this or that may well get a lot of support, and as a result be able to prosper. And I think that's dangerous. So if young economists are finding that they have to kind of, I wouldn't say prevaricate or lie, but I think kind of shape their research to conform with some norm about what, you know, I'll give you an example. Now this may be really controversial, but
please
think of the issue about race.
Okay.
Race. I mean, right now in American society, race is a taboo subject. It's become almost beyond public discussion. We can't honestly talk about it. In many cases, people get tarred and feathered, literally, for making statements. Like one of the best established facts by any labor economist looking at almost any data set are sharp ability differences between, among different ethnic and racial groups. That's a fact. And it's a fact that you have to live with. It's not some manufactured reality. And yet a lot of people want to say that anybody uttering that phrase should be abolished from it. I don't know how it is here at Purdue. If you have honest, maybe you don't want to get on the subject then.
No, we're sort of, we're adopters of the Chicago policies on free expression. So
no, I think that's important. So I think this kind of so to me, the discussion of race, you know, just think of the polarization right now. Last month, the New York Times had its featured headline that massive racism was keeping black men down. Not black women, by the way, but black men. And, you know, so it's racism. The idea is we have this massive surge of racism. Meanwhile, Roland Fryer, who's a black economist, and a lot of others are saying the declining role of discrimination in America, and that it's much more kind of family, class-based. Well, that's not a trivial debate to settle. That's a really important debate. Is it going to be like a civil rights enforcement policy? Are we going to re-educate people about racial perceptions? Or are we going to think about building families, building skills, and so forth? That's a first-order question. And I think we have to be able to address it honestly and come out with the answer. Well, it's not that they're mutually exclusive, but many economists, I think right now the view, racism is too easy an explanation. Well, now.
Let me ask you this. So you're in the economics department of Chicago, but you also have appointments at the Harris School and some other folks. I think.
Right.
Am I right about that?
Correct.
So what I'm curious about, especially for these sort of fraught issues, like the one you were just speaking about, how important is it for people to get out of their disciplinary homes and see the issue from distinct perspectives? So not just economists, but sociologists and other folks kind of coming at these kinds of issues to sort of see their blind spots in the analysis.
Well, for example, the sociologists on these questions of family and on questions of even race and, you know, wage differentials have a large body of work. I mean, they're looking at, 30 or 40 years ago, the sociologists were way ahead of economists and like even certain technical fields like duration analysis and event history analysis. But so the cooperation with sociologists is natural. They have a database. They don't have the same interpretive models. But you would hope that over, at least for the same data, you would agree on the same set of facts. And I think that's a very productive group. But it's also interesting to talk across disciplines, even with the sociologists, but especially other disciplines, to see what their takes are on these differences. And so I think to me, it's very informative, sometimes frightening, but informative, that there are points of view about race, about differences among individuals that you can see are deeply believed, they're deeply held. And I think any kind of public discussion about these issues has to recognize that as a point of view and address it. Even if you think it's wrong, you don't just say that's nonsense. I think you can say, look, here are some facts. Let's see where we can get common ground of agreement and about the facts. What worries me is that sometimes in some of these comparisons, people don't even want to do that. They'll say, I'm not going to get near. I was in a symposium a couple of years ago at the University of Chicago. This is celebrating, I've forgotten, some anniversary in the social science division. And we were talking about the importance of the family, something that's been studied by many Chicagoans. Becker wrote some famous work, but there are others as well, and sociologists and people in human development. There are a whole group of people studying the family, lawyers and so forth. And we looked at what family resources, and we said, look, there has been a very big trend in families being split up. I mean, a lot of people are now writing about the two Americas. You have a lot of sorting is going on. We are finding much more sorting, even by neighborhood residential status in terms of income and socioeconomic status. Most of the children who are growing up outside of wedlock and are really traditionally in homes that are relatively poor, not very well resourced, and their parents are not highly educated. If you look, for example, like the out of wedlock birth rates of college graduate women are by about 10%, very low. Other groups, 60%, and you get down to high school dropouts. And so I think you have to say that, but people saying that, no, and it turns out some groups are overrepresented, and okay, the question is, are there common socioeconomic factors, or is there something uniquely about a group? And they would say even discussing this is offensive. There's a whole set of controversies that go along about culture. Take culture. Many people find that very, very difficult to talk about. There are all these discussions, what was the title? This book about, I'm going to forget the name of the book, but there are plenty of discussions about cultural differences, about child rearing and so forth. And people see very successful families, in groups with very successful families, others with less successful families, measuring success by the child achievements, arrest rates, educational attainment, earnings, and so forth. So getting into that zone of culture, which economists really don't know all that well. I mean, we're starting to venture into it, but it's really a deep and unsettled question, at least in economics. And other fields have tried to attack it and address it. Economists probably could address it more constructively than they do now. But recognize that it is a factor and understanding so addressing that, I think we can actually make very important contributions.
So I'm going to ask one more question, but those of you who might want to ask a question at the mics, just step on up so we're ready to go as soon as I ask this last one. So this is a university administrator question. In light of what you just said, those kind of connections that really enrich discussion and debate and research, is that the sort of thing that should just arise organically in the academy? Or are there things that we should do to try and facilitate more of the kind of interactions and so economists don't understand culture? Is that something we should do something about, or just let individuals figure it out?
Well, I think that there is a fear. I mean, we have a certain filtering process now, how people get into the profession and stay in the profession. And the very filter itself affects the future of the profession. So I think there's a sense that if people venture too widely from the standard base, they risk possibly obscurity and ending up in the basement of some consulting firm, far away from the academic environment they were aiming for. So I think there's a lot of academic, safe, playing it safely, and therefore not being willing to tackle some of these big issues. Like any young professor who was talking about race, who wasn't tenured, might well be committing academic suicide, especially if his tenure is reviewed by people who are interdisciplinary and have very strong views about race. But some of the other matters about the family and ability differences and on and on and on. So I do think that the academic, I think it's difficult. I think people relying too much on kind of tenure processes that are too formulaic and don't recognize kind of creativity and difference. It's very hard to recognize that though. You know, when is somebody doing something genuinely new and not? Think of Akerlof's paper, you know, on lemons. That was, and when that was originally published, that was viewed as a joke. And Spence too, the signaling work. So that was the era of general equilibrium, right? And so this looks so low grade, the kind of simple price theory models they had. It was not very technical. So, you know, this just wasn't good, you know. Sard's theorem wasn't anywhere in sight and so forth. So the question was then how the profession can get past that. Now, I think in many cases they did get past it. Akerlof survived and prospered with some glitches along the way. But I do think that sort of examining the basic quality of an investigator, of a young candidate, it's harder than relying on just kind of journal accounts and so forth.
Well, so you've spoken about this problem with relying on sort of outsourcing tenure decisions to the editors of top 5 publications.
Oh,
and
it's a huge question. Yeah.
I mean, so one of the ways we talk about it here is that reading is a higher order skill than counting, and we should encourage reading whenever possible. But
reading's very costly, as you know.
It is costly. So
Yeah.
what do you do about that?
Well, but look, I mean, we have a paper we've written. We saw a version of it at the AA meetings in Chicago last year, actually. But basically, what we can see, I mean, if you look at tenure promotion rates, the speed, whether you're promoted at all, being in the top 5, so-called top 5 journal, plays a big role. Everybody knows it. And actually, in tenure discussions, I don't know how they are here, but in a lot of tenure discussions, not just in Chicago, but in many other places, I know this from colleagues, are basically saying this guy has so many top 5s. And at certain universities, one top 5 is certain for tenure. Yeah, I know that for a fact. I'm a co-editor of one of these so-called top 5 journals. And so the question is this kind of centralization? First of all, if you ask questions about how useful are the top 5 within individual fields, you'll find in a lot of, what do you think is the most influential journal in development?
I would guess the Journal of Development Economics, no?
No, the World Bank Economic Review.
Ah.
It's the most cited, very highly cited. And so you think about econometrics, what's more cited? Econometrica or the Journal of Econometrics? The Journal of Econometrics. Yeah. And in a lot of the field journal. So it's a very funny business we have going on. I think it's perverted in some sense. Everybody ends up being a field specialist, more and more. The generalists are kind of dying out. Very hard to be a generalist. It's really, to know all fields in economics now, I think it might have been possible in 1940 or 1950. I think it's impossible now. So you do have to delegate. You have to rely on your colleagues and do things. But I think right now you do have this specialization. And so the tenure funnel is asking people to publish in general interest journals. But the people voting on tenure are themselves largely reading and publishing in special field journals. So there's a sense of hypocrisy here going on. Hypocrisy. And what's even more damaging, we've actually looked at some of these statistics. What we see is that if you look at journals that are not top 5, like the Economic Journal or the Review of Economics and Statistics, they're very highly cited. In fact, they overlap strongly. And in one case, it's overlapped completely with one of these so-called top 5 journals. So that if you just look at how many people are reading and citing those journals, and they're off limit. I mean, there's this big discontinuity. If you get into Review of Economics and Statistics, it's like you've fallen off the face of the earth in some environments. So I think the structure has to be But it is time intensive, and I agree with you. I think it's a question, though, in demanding maybe that there be more interaction on the actual work rather than just counting journal articles. But the pressure on the young faculty is intense. It's huge. They're all kind of gaming. Will this editor like this paper? Should I cite this guy's work? Should I be, and on and on and on. And it's corrupting in some sense. We computed incest coefficients. And the
incest coefficients.
Yes, we have incest coefficients.
Okay.
And it's asking how important was it to be in the circle, like a PhD from the House Journal, or an affiliate in some ways of the House Journal within a network for publishing. And for some journals, it's very high. For the Journal of Public, the lowest ranking journal in this incest was Econometrica. Partly because Econometrica has fixed terms, it rolls over. It's, there's no way that anybody's going to seize control of the journal Econometrica. But other journals, like the Quarterly Journal of Economics,
the house organ of mass
Yeah, no, it's actually, no, but you can see, if you look at the incest coefficient, it's quite high. PhDs or people who work with PhDs, so people say, well, how do you publish in the journal? Then the answer would go to be a PhD from Harvard, might be the best answer for that. So I think that's bad. I think it creates then, especially if that is, as it is, one of the top 5 journals. JPE has some of that, but in terms of the incest coefficient, it's quite a bit lower, but higher than Econometrica. And if you look, for example, at influence of these journals, many people say, well, a very influential journal is the American Economic Review. More citations to that. But if you look at citations per paper published, not so high. AER is not doing all that well. Publishes a lot of junk, but it publishes many, many papers, many more than almost any other journal. And so as a result, it gets a lot of citations, but not per journal article.
Interesting.
And so even the indiscriminate use of citation counts allegedly codified in the top 5 is not being used in the way that you would. And in fact, if you want a high citation journal and you're in economics, then Science Magazine or Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences has a much higher citation count than any of the aforementioned journals. But that's viewed as having fallen off the face of the earth. And there you get to a very wide community, but you're not appealing to the specialists. So I think it shapes the profession. The junior economists here can testify. I think I asked them too. I don't know how many. We had this survey that we sent out. It got a very poor response rate, though. And I guess they think we're going to use it against them, but we're not. But the point is that I think that I've talked to a lot of young economists, and it's hard not to. They sit down and they start, I remember being at dinner conversations at conferences, and they talk about this guy as being really a hot star. And so I say, what about him? Well, he has 3 top 5s. And they list where it's published. I say, wait, what did he do? What was done? They won't even know that. They know that this person has 3 top 5s, or she has 4 top 5s, or something. And so, to me, we've moved to it's more kind of a Twitter type evaluation system where it's fast and furious, and you can just count. Or look at citation counts.
Yeah.
You look at people introduce that. So, you can get a big citation count by publishing a crummy paper that gets a lot of refutations. And, it happens, actually. It happens. So I think, so you're asking, what can you do? I know it's time intensive, but I think that I think we should, first of all, recognize that it's there. And you realize that the profession has grown, and the number of slots at these top 5 journals has not essentially grown. So what's happened is the probability of anybody publishing in those top 5 journals has shrunk just from the sheer volume, if you just think about it as a random sorting. So it's become a filter that's increasingly high, and then it can be manipulated. You can decide. I mean, I know, and it's not a good feeling, I think, that I can confer tenure on somebody by accepting his or her paper at certain universities. I know that. That's not a good power for me to have, or any single person to have, or even editorial board. I mean, I should be able to maybe contribute, but not. So I think that's too, I don't know, I consider it a very arbitrary filter. But I do think it leads to a certain style of economics. And maybe it's more like replication economics, or so one foot in front of the other. Joe Blow did this, I can do it a little better. And so that's very clear, it's predictable. You come along with something off the wall that is just totally unacceptable. For example, like, take Becker's book on racial discrimination, or take, we talked about Akerlof, but there are a lot of other papers where people just thought that, the mainstream thought this was nuts. Search theory, when the original rounds of search theory, I think it's very significant that if you look at a lot of the citations for the search theory Nobel Prize, they weren't all, predominantly even, in the top 5 journals. They were journals like the International Economic Review, JET, and so forth, journals that are considered off the... Why? Because those journals would entertain something new. It was somewhat technical, it was offbeat, but they could recognize the fundamental integrity of what was going on. That's true. They were valuing partly on the the technical contribution. So I do think we should recognize just our own mistakes in the past and recognize, that some of these other notions, some of these really avant-garde ideas, we should at least consider their potential value. But that requires maybe if all the faculties consist of people who've gone through this process and who themselves have spent their whole lives trying to publish in the top 5, then they won't be very sympathetic to this. They're too busy getting their own top 5s out, I guess. So it does create a kind of mindset that may not be very constructive for the future of the field. That worries me considerably.
So let's take some time for some questions from the audience. So we have 2 microphones up here.
So I was wondering, you mentioned that Denmark paper, and that this kind of ties together a few things, but I think we can learn some really interesting stuff about mobility that we kind of didn't know before from that kind of analysis, using that big data and asking kind of deeper questions that have been asked in that literature. And I was wondering if you could comment briefly on what some interesting things we might learn from that, from kind of deeper international comparisons like what you and Dr. Landerso did there might be.
Well, I people are increasingly using these administrative data sets. Here in the US, Chetty and so forth, we don't have quite the quality of the data that the Scandinavians have. But I think you can learn a lot. Simply because you can put pieces together. You're looking at trade shocks on health. It sounds really interesting. I think the fact that we can now have matched worker firm data sets changes IO, and it changes in international trade. We can do things that we don't know. So I think the access to this data really just opens the opportunity to study questions. The recent paper about wage gaps and the extent in which male-female wages were due to productivity differences and due to other factors. This was in Denmark. And having pretty good measures of productivity, this scholar found that productivity played a role, but it wasn't the predominant issue for any wage gap that was there. In fact, there weren't wage gaps in certain categories for women. So I think it enriches the kind of questions we can answer. And I think, but there's a mystery we have in Denmark. I think it's a mystery. And it's a mystery that Denmark is a social welfare state which is near equality. The so-called intergenerational coefficient, how much the post-tax transfer income of the father, or the parents, I should say, influence the outcome of the child. That coefficient is very low, which means there's a lot of mobility from the condition compared to what goes on in the US. So we can learn from that. But what we've also learned, which is interesting, is that despite what are very substantial equality in expenditures, school expenditures, health expenditures, a lot of the disparities that receive so much attention in the US, nonetheless, there are still substantial differences by family background in Denmark. And this is even among Danes. You can take the Turks and the the North Africans who came into the environment, take out any immigrant group and stay within the so-called original Danes or native Danes group, you can still find substantial differences that persist over the life cycle. So that's an interesting question. So a lot of the candidate explanations have been eliminated. Public expenditure, targeting. Why are those gaps there? Well, the one obvious candidate is sorting. There's a lot of sorting, and it's gone up in Denmark just as much in the US. So, there's a sense that if you have equality in expenditure, you can have a lot of inequality in outcomes if the parents are actually investing more. So you have equally qualified schools, but you're adding to the school additional parenting input that's not present for other kids with less advantage. And so equalization, ironically, can lead to fundamental disequalization in terms of outcomes. So I think we can learn things about that. We're looking at that right now. We're looking at those kinds of roles. Yeah.
Please.
With regards to advocacy groups trying to shape research or somebody trying to shape research towards a certain talking point or to get published, how do we safeguard against outside influences trying to corrupt research?
Well, I think there is a policy increasingly by journals to talk about who is directly sponsoring your research. So if your research has been sponsored by, say, a Lorillard tobacco company or something, American Tobacco Company, British American Tobacco Company, I'm not quite sure which one survived. But, and you're writing about smoking, and you're writing about something that concerns the regulation of these companies, that should be revealed, and that has been asked to be revealed. It's not always revealed. What should we do about it? What can we do about it? Well, it's hard. Agendas get set by organizations. If people are deeply interested in the structure of a particular problem and want to focus on that problem, you can at least have lots of papers on that topic. And it's hard to avoid that. You could say, well, no, I want to sponsor everything. I think the government review panels, are partial protection, but they're not safe. There's certainly a lot of insularity, a lot of inbreeding. There's a very, we form clubs. And I think increasingly economics and other fields have these clubs, support groups, right? They reinforce each other. They read each other's papers. They reject the other's papers. They fund people like them, and they basically reject the people not like them. And it's difficult to break into those support groups. I would say a lot of universities can do that in part by bringing in dissenting groups, bringing in people who have different points of view. But then if the different points of view are arrived at through through basically absence of data, suppose that somebody says, I was inspired by reading Das Kapital, that's my evidence, and somebody else is saying, I was analyzing the American Community Survey and saw this. I don't know if you want to weight those two kind of sources equally, but that's a judgment. I know there are a lot of people who would weight the Das Kapital reader far more than a bunch of number runners from the ACS. But I do think that we can encourage this kind of diverse point of view. I think it's very hard. I think it's getting harder. So I can announce I don't know what the exact cure is, but I do think the advocacy groups shape. And the foundations have moved away. Ford Foundation is not funding a lot of basic research. They fund advocacy for certain outreach efforts. Whereas in the 1920s and 30s, they were funding only like agricultural research and so forth. So there's still foundations that fund research. Howard Hughes in medicine. There are, and actually, surprisingly, in many groups that are allegedly very politically oriented, actually are supporting basic science, like the Koch brothers, actually. I know they're a hot button number in certain political domains, but I think they're also supporting a lot of hardcore science at universities. And you see, like the Ely Broad Institute, so the Broad Group was actually, so there are still some supports. I'm not saying it's all bad, but there is, take this vanity project that Zuckerberg had in the Newark Public Schools. He spent $50 million. He wanted to make a splash. See, that's where the billionaires have this deep weakness. They want a program with their name on it and a nice splash, right? And so he spent $50 million on the Newark schools, and everybody says it was a total disaster, right? It did not do anything. It just kind of shuffled things around. And there are a lot of examples like that. People spending money partly to make a splash. And the support of basic research is harder and harder. You know, it gets really hard to say, look, I want to support a mathematician working on Lie groups for the solution of partial differential equations. You say, what the hell? I'm running it's not going to make the New York Times tomorrow or even in 100 years from now. So and so if you want to splash, and I think increasingly there's this splashiness that's out there. And it's a trend, you should face it. And I guess you say ride the bull, and you can still make your splash and keep going. But I think there is a sense that that basic research is having a hard time. I don't know if you think that's true. Especially in social science, but even in mathematics. The funding in mathematics and basic physics has really shrunk. State support has really fallen off, and it's partly because the budgets from the states have fallen off. So there really is, and the federal government is not, substituting for that lost state support.
Yeah. Question.
Hi, I'm an undergrad student learning econ. I'm thinking about going to grad school. But one thing you mentioned a lot about today, it's the data analyzing, the econometrics, the more and more data coming in the field makes the industry is changing. Then what is the bigger thing that distinguish a economics from like a data analyst or like the education? Why should I go to grad school to learn economics instead of learning data analyst?
Well, I mean, there's a difference between kind of summarizing data and finding empirical regularities and interpreting data. And the trouble is you can become overwhelmed. I mentioned this Frisch quote. That's the danger. You can have lots of empirical regularities. What do you make out of them? I can read to you after quite a while the New York telephone directory, name by name and so forth. So what? I mean, what do I get from that? I guess what I think economics, the role of economics, it has some interpretive frameworks. In the end, we are trying to interpret the world and maybe even change it. When we think about changing it, we want to think about causal models. We want to think about models that will guide us towards policies that have not yet been implemented or are being proposed now. And so I think a big role for social science, and especially economics, is to guide us in thinking about how to interpret the data and to look at anomalies in a way that's constructive. So it's very easy. In fact, there's a danger of a flood. If we run hundreds of experiments here, there, and everywhere, what do we learn from all those experiments? What's the common overriding theme? And that's the danger. So these facts kind of get lost in space. It's kind of like, sending a signal out to Saturn or something. It's headed out somewhere. Who is listening? God knows. What's the significance? God knows. I think we want to try to make those signals kind of cohere. I think that's pretty much the goal of most human beings, to try to have a story. And the story is a coherent story. And I think social science allows us to tell coherent stories. So story sounds like I'm making something up, but I mean coherent explanations. So you look at empirical regularities, I think it's really helpful. See, the danger would be if you start thinking that each time you get a fact, you make up a new model. I don't know if you ever read much Aristotle. You ever read his physics? Okay. Aristotle sounded pretty circular, why did something, it's of the nature of the thing that it would do that. Well, what does that mean? Nothing. Yeah. And so we really want to understand what the nature is and what parts of the nature matter. So I think what you really want to do is think about, so I think it's the boiling down. That's in the end what we value. That's actually why Malcolm Gladwell is as popular as he is. He boils it down. I think he maybe boils it down a little too much, but that's another whole issue. But the point is that people want simple answers. And I think that the value of social science, in particular economics, is that it does provide some simple answers and frameworks, but it also provides the nuance. So we don't just kind of say, oh, we want to do this or that, and just kind of go making policy based on some empirical regularity they don't really understand. So I think that's what I see as the value.
Thank you.
So I think that's a good place for us to stop. I want to, everybody please join me in thanking Professor Heckman. And the Pence family who sponsored our event today. And we look forward to this being the first of many challenging opportunities to engage with some pretty sharp and inquisitive people. So thanks for being here today.
Okay, thank you.